The Johnsons were a close-knit family. Michael Johnson, a tall, broad-shouldered man, had always been the pillar of the family. His wife, Claire, was the heart. Educated, refined, and with a contagious smile, she always knew how to turn any space into a home. Their children, Marcus, 17, and Jasmine, 12, completed what seemed like the perfect family, or so they thought. They had moved from a chaotic big city to a quiet suburb, seeking a fresh start and more security. The neighborhood where they had bought their new home was lined with tree-shaded streets and well-manicured lawns. A dream of tranquility and stability for any family. The late afternoon sun spilled over the rooftops of the white houses, and children played in the street while neighbors chatted on their porches. It was the scene Claire had always wanted for her children. Marcus, with dreams of becoming a basketball player, and Jasmine, with her insatiable curiosity, deserved to grow up in a place like this. When the moving truck stopped in front of the house, the mood on the street seemed to change. Whispering began immediately, as some neighbors watched from a distance. Claire noticed the subtle glances, but chose to ignore them. She was determined to make a good start here. "This is a good place for a fresh start," Michael said, taking Claire's hand. She smiled at him, confident. "Yes, it's perfect." However, not everything was as it seemed. Next door to the Johnsons, in an old Victorian house with wide windows and a porch covered in plants, lived Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman with gray hair and an always stern expression. She silently watched the movement from her living room window, eyes narrowed and mouth set in a displeased line. That same evening, as the Johnsons began to settle in, Claire decided to do something she thought appropriate. Visit the neighbor to introduce herself. Michael was unpacking boxes in the basement, and the children were upstairs organizing their rooms. "It's better to break the ice right away," Claire thought. She put on a simple dress, picked up a cake she had brought from their old home, and walked over to the neighbor's house. The door was opened by Mrs. Thompson, who greeted her with a suspicious expression. "Good evening. I'm Claire Johnson, your new neighbor. I brought you a cake as a gift," she said, extending the dessert with a warm smile. Mrs. Thompson stared at her, as if weighing every word. Her eyes briefly flicked over Claire's dark skin before settling on the cake. After a few seconds of uncomfortable silence, she spoke in a cold tone. "I don't need gifts from strangers." The door abruptly closed before Claire could say anything else. Returning home, Claire tried to hide her disappointment, but Michael sensed her mood. "She wasn't very welcoming, was she?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Claire shrugged, trying to change the subject. "Maybe she just needs time," Claire said, half believing her own words. The next day, the Johnsons woke up excited. It was the first day in their new home, and the kids were eager to explore the neighborhood. Michael was preparing for his first day at his new job, though he hadn't revealed his role to anyone yet. He had always been discreet about his career and was about to assume the position of police chief in the city. While walking the family dog, Max, Claire noticed more glances from some neighbors. Whispers stopped as she approached. She felt uncomfortable but forced to smile and kept walking. At the end of the street, Marcus and Jasmine were playing basketball on the sidewalk, laughing and having fun. However, Mrs. Thompson was always watching, sitting on her porch with a look of disdain. With every laugh from the children, she seemed to grow more irritated. When the sound of the basketball echoed down the street, she finally came down the porch steps and walked over to the siblings. "Could you make less noise?" she said in a dry, cold voice. "Some of us appreciate peace and quiet in this neighborhood." Marcus, surprised by her tone, stopped playing. "Sorry, ma'am. We'll try to play further away," he said, pulling Jasmine aside. Claire, watching the scene from afar, felt uneasy. Michael reassured her when he got home, saying, "She's just a bitter old woman, Claire. Don't let it get to you." But things would only get worse. Mrs. Thompson seemed determined to make life increasingly difficult for the Johnsons. Every move the family made was monitored. Every sound they made was criticized. One evening, while the family was having dinner, the doorbell rang. Michael opened the door to find a police officer. "We've received a noise complaint. Neighbors have been reporting constant disturbances from this house," said the officer, visibly embarrassed to be there. Michael, surprised, simply nodded and assured the officer they would resolve any noise issues. As he closed the door, he knew exactly who had made the complaint. The truth, however, was that Mrs. Thompson still didn't know who Michael really was. To her, he was just another black man in her neighborhood, someone who, in her distorted view, didn't belong there. But the revelation would come soon. The town's big welcome event was happening that weekend. It was an annual tradition where new residents were officially introduced to the community. Claire and Michael knew this event would be crucial for the family to truly integrate into the neighborhood, and they decided to attend despite the hostile glances. The town square was filled with food stalls and live music. Neighbors gathered, children ran around, and the atmosphere was festive. Claire and Michael were chatting with some friendly neighbors while Marcus and Jasmine explored the stalls. Then, the mayor stepped onto the makeshift stage in the center of the square and took the microphone. And now, it's with great honor that I introduce to you the new chief of police of our town, someone who promises to be a great leader for all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Johnson. A hush fell over the crowd for a moment, followed by murmurs of shock. Michael, who had until then remained anonymous among the crowd, stepped onto the stage with a modest smile. Claire, by his side, felt the weight of the stares on them. Mrs. Thompson, also present, froze. Her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face. She had never imagined that the man she so despised was, in fact, an authority figure. The Johnsons were here to stay, and this was just the beginning. The revelation that Michael was the new police chief sent a quiet shockwave through the neighborhood. As he walked back with Claire after being introduced, the murmurs persisted. There was a mix of surprise, curiosity, and, for some, like Mrs. Thompson, deep discomfort. Claire, always observant, immediately noticed the change in the neighbors' expressions. Some, who had previously seemed willing to keep their distance, now approached with hesitant greetings and forced smiles. "Congratulations, Michael. Police chief, huh?" said one man, shaking his hand with restrained enthusiasm. Michael, always polite and calm, responded firmly. "Thank you. I hope to contribute to the safety and well-being of everyone in this town." However, when his eyes met Mrs. Thompson's, he saw something different. She was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze filled with disdain. The revelation that Michael, the man she considered an intruder, held such power in her town seemed to be a devastating blow to her. Throughout the event, the Johnsons' presence was marked by a mix of acceptance and tension. Some neighbors showed sympathy, but the weight of racial prejudice, which had already begun to emerge, could not be ignored. "What did you think of the event?" Claire asked as they walked back home. Michael sighed, knowing he would be honest. "It went better than I expected, but we can feel that it won't be easy." In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the Johnson household became more strained. Mrs. Thompson's behavior became even more intrusive and hostile. Now, she didn't just watch them from her window with disdain. She confronted them directly. If Jasmine was playing in the yard, Mrs. Thompson would show up and start sweeping the sidewalk forcefully, muttering about respect for neighbors. If Marcus played basketball, she made sure to complain about the noise, always in a harsh manner. One morning, as Claire watered the plants in her garden, Mrs. Thompson came out of her house, clearly intent on saying something. Her steps were quick, her face hardened by accumulated anger. "Can I talk to you?" she said, with no trace of kindness. Claire looked at her with a mix of surprise and weariness. "Sure, what's going on?" Claire replied, keeping her calm. Mrs. Thompson didn't hesitate. "I don't want to be rude, but ever since you arrived, this neighborhood, which has always been quiet and orderly, has been different. Noise, constant movement. This isn't the kind of behavior we expect here." Claire felt her blood boil, but with the dignity she always maintained, she responded firmly. "We're just living our lives. We have as much right to be here as you do, Mrs. Thompson." The old woman huffed, crossing her arms. "Maybe, but your family, you just don't belong here." Claire looked at her, incredulous at the bluntness of the prejudice. She knew those words weren't just about noise or movement. They were about race, about who, in Mrs. Thompson's narrow view, should or shouldn't live there. "I think the problem isn't us, Mrs. Thompson. The problem is your prejudice, Claire replied calmly before heading back inside. As tensions with Mrs. Thompson escalated, the Johnsons also began to notice that she wasn't alone in her feelings. There was a small but influential group of neighbors who shared her views. Subtly, they kept their distance, always showing superficial courtesy but never hiding their discomfort with the family's presence. One incident, in particular, marked the beginning of a drastic shift in how the Johnsons perceived the neighborhood. Marcus, now attending the local school, was doing well in his classes and, more importantly, excelling on the basketball team. He made new friends but also noticed certain looks and comments he couldn't ignore. One day, while playing on the school court, a classmate, Eric, approached him after an impressive play. "You're good for someone like you." Marcus paused, confused. "What do you mean, someone like me?" Eric shrugged, trying to play it off with a smile. "Oh, we don't have many guys like you here, but it's all good." That stuck with Marcus for the rest of the day. He knew what it meant, even though the boy tried to hide it behind a casual tone. The prejudice was there, present, veiled, but real. That night, during dinner, Marcus finally opened up to his parents. "Do you feel like people here treat us differently?" he asked, his fork pausing in his hand. Michael and Claire exchanged looks. They knew exactly what their son was talking about. "Yes, son. Some people have preconceived notions about who we are simply because of the color of our skin," Michael said calmly. "But we can't let that define us or stop us from moving forward." "It's hard," Marcus said, looking down. "Sometimes it feels like we'll never be accepted here." Jasmine, younger, seemed to be trying to grasp what this meant for her, but Marcus's words struck deep. She was also beginning to notice what was happening around her. The situation worsened when Michael had to deal directly with issues related to racial prejudice, now in his job. Some members of the town's police force didn't accept that he, a black man, was in charge. There were looks of disdain and veiled comments in the department, but Michael was an experienced man and wasn't easily shaken. He knew it would be tough, but he was ready to face whatever came his way. However, the pressure also began to reflect at home. Mrs. Thompson escalated her petty provocations. Constant complaints to the city about issues at the Johnson house started appearing regularly. The neighborhood seemed to be dividing, with a few showing solidarity, while others distanced themselves even further. One night, while the Johnson family slept, something disturbing happened. Michael woke up to a strange sound outside the house. When he looked out the window, he saw a figure running down the street. He quickly went downstairs, and when he opened the front door, he was met with a shocking scene. Graffiti on their wall with racist slurs. Claire, who came right behind him, was stunned. The children woke up and came downstairs, only to see the look of anger and pain on their father's face. "I'll handle this," Michael said, trying to stay calm. But this was the last straw. Michael knew he couldn't let this go unnoticed any longer. It was time to take a stronger stand. However, what he didn't yet know was that behind all these events, there were deeper secrets hidden in Mrs. Thompson's past and within the community itself. The morning after the attack, Michael was determined to find out who was behind the graffiti. He knew that, as police chief, he needed to stay calm, but as a father and husband, it struck him deeply. Michael began investigating thoroughly, reviewing nearby security cameras and discreetly asking neighbors questions. Meanwhile, Claire felt the growing tension in their home. She noticed that Jasmine, usually cheerful and curious, was becoming more withdrawn. Marcus, always so confident, seemed more serious and avoided conversations. The weight of prejudice was leaving marks on the family. Claire knew she needed to do something to protect her children emotionally, but she also had to support Michael, who bore the responsibility of being a leader in a town where not everyone wanted to follow him. In this tense atmosphere, Claire had an unexpected encounter. While shopping at the local market, an elderly woman approached her. It was a woman Claire had seen around the neighborhood, but they had never spoken directly. "You're Claire, right?" said the woman in a friendly yet cautious tone. "Yes," Claire replied, surprised by the approach. "Have we met?" "Not directly, but I heard about what happened at your house yesterday. I wanted to tell you that not everyone here shares Mrs. Thompson's feelings. In fact, most of us don't know why she became so bitter." Claire, curious, encouraged the woman to continue. She wasn't always like this. There was a time when she was a decent person, but that was before she lost her son. This revelation caught Claire off guard. The rigid, cruel image of Mrs. Thompson that she had built in her mind was shaken by that sentence. She lost her son? Claire asked, leaning forward, intrigued. Yes, it was an accident. Over 20 years ago, her son, Richard, was killed in a robbery. He was working late at a convenience store, and a black man killed him. Silence fell between them. Claire felt a lump in her throat. Now, Mrs. Thompson's hostility had a deeper explanation than she had imagined. The pain of that loss had turned the woman into someone bitter and filled with hatred. That explains a lot, Claire said, with a mix of compassion and sadness. Yes, but it doesn't justify it, the woman replied firmly. You and your family shouldn't have to pay for someone else's mistakes. Claire thanked her for the conversation and returned home with a new understanding of her neighbor. She knew that this information changed the context, but she also understood that Mrs. Thompson's prejudice could no longer be ignored or forgiven simply because of her personal tragedy. While Claire processed this new information, Michael made progress in his investigation. The street security cameras didn't clearly show the person who had graffitied their house, but Michael began hearing rumors about a small group of troubled youths in the neighborhood. They were known for graffiti and vandalism, but nothing as targeted as what had happened to the Johnsons' home. He soon discovered that these youths were connected to a network of neighbors who, while not openly racist, didn't approve of the family's arrival in the neighborhood. Among these neighbors, Mrs. Thompson was a leading figure, someone who subtly encouraged the separation between us and them. Michael knew he needed to confront the situation, and the opportunity came sooner than expected. One night, while he and Claire were discussing what to do, a new incident occurred. This time, it was more direct. An anonymous letter was left at the Johnsons' door. The words were cruel, making it clear that their presence wasn't welcome there. Michael couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed the letter and, with the courage and dignity he had always carried, walked straight to Mrs. Thompson's house. Claire followed, worried but understanding that this moment was inevitable. Mrs. Thompson was sitting on her porch, as usual. When she saw Michael approaching, she narrowed her eyes, already knowing that something was coming. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice firm but calm. We need to talk. The elderly woman stood up, disdainful. I don't know what we have to talk about, Mr. Johnson. We have nothing in common. Michael didn't let her words shake him. We have more in common than you think. I know about your son, and I'm sorry for what happened. No one should have to go through that. The mention of her son was like a blow. Mrs. Thompson paled, and for a moment, her stern face cracked, revealing the pain hidden behind so much resentment. You don't know anything about what it's like to lose someone like that, she hissed. No, I don't. But I know what it's like to be judged for who you are, for what you seem to be, and not for who you really are. My family is being punished for something we didn't do, and that needs to stop. Mrs. Thompson shook her head, but Michael continued. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to say that this situation can't go on. I understand that you've suffered an unimaginable loss, but that doesn't give you the right to treat my family like enemies. We're here to live in peace, just like you. The silence between them was long and heavy. Mrs. Thompson looked at him, something changing in her expression. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't unbridled hatred anymore, either. There was confusion, maybe even doubt. If you want peace, she said, her voice hesitant, then stay away from me. Michael nodded. I will, but we both know this community will have to change. It can't go on like this. He turned and walked back home, leaving Mrs. Thompson alone with her thoughts. Claire, watching from a distance, felt relieved, but she knew the battle was far from over. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Thompson, always reserved and reclusive, came out of her house and began talking to the closest neighbors. No one knew exactly what she was saying, but the reactions were varied. Some seemed surprised, others silently agreed. In the following weeks, some neighbors' attitudes began to change. Rumors about Mrs. Thompson's past and the reason for her hatred began to circulate. Many realized that they had been manipulated by an old, irrational grudge. However, The most surprising gesture came from Mrs. Thompson herself. One afternoon, as Claire was in the garden, the old neighbor appeared. She didn't have her usual hardened expression, but rather a restrained look. "I brought this for you," she said, handing over a small cake, similar to the one Claire had tried to offer months before. "I don't expect this to fix anything, but maybe we can start over." Claire stood in silence for a moment, shocked by the gesture. After everything, the last thing she expected was an attempt at reconciliation. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," she replied, accepting the cake with a soft smile. "I hope we can, too." It was a small gesture, but it symbolized something much larger. It might not be the end of prejudice or racial tension in the neighborhood, but it was a beginning. A beginning of mutual understanding that could only happen when people were willing to face their deepest fears and hurts. Michael, watching the scene from the window, knew that the road ahead would still be long. But for that small victory, he was grateful. After all, real change begins with the first steps,